welcome to today's program. We'll be talking about diversity and threat and violence risk assessments. And it's a great topic, one that we're excited to share with you. As I mentioned, we'd love to hear your feedback, whether you're watching this live or in a recording. Love to hear from you about what you liked, what you didn't like, how we can do this better. We're always in this growth mindset of paying attention to how we can improve. Tammy, Dr. Hodo, I'm going to have her give the intro. So tell us about yourself.
So hello, everyone, calling in from the state of Florida, where we are having a lot of challenges. I am originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I have served in academia as a diversity officer as well as a faculty member. My doctorate is from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm in urban studies with a minor in sociology, but I specifically focus on race, class, gender, and ethnicity. The reason being is my parents married in '62, which is not a big to-do, but they do not match. So I did a TED Talk called The Social Implications of Race, where I basically traced the census. And then I did one after the murder of George Floyd, and I am also the president and founder of All Things Diverse. So thank you for allowing me that space, Brian.
And I'll just give you a quick, brief summary of where I am and what I'm doing. I'm trying to flip out some spotlights here. So the background that I have as a child and family therapist to begin, I got involved in college work, emergency services, and really had a passion for the idea of threat assessment. I was at a small rural school up in New England College in Henniker, and found myself really needing to up my game in terms of a director of counseling in the threat assessment space. And at first I looked at a lot of different measures, a lot of different psychological measures like the Paulus Deception Scale, the MMPI-2, the Thematic Apperception Test, the Rorschach. I got very interested in using psychological measures to look at threat. And then I was lucky enough to go to an ATAP conference and begin my training in the threat space and really picking up what a lot of folks have been doing for quite some time. So from there, I worked with a company called TNG, or the NCRM Group. I ran a company called NBITA. I was one of the founders of that, developed a lot of their threat assessment tools, the CIVRA, the ERIS, the NBITA risk rubric, and then moved into some security work in the Jewish Federation doing instructional design for a lot of their federal law enforcement officers who were teaching in various cities across the country. I spent some time with a company called CPS HR and working with Tammy in DEI issues, as well as issues related to gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. So that's a little bit about me in a nutshell. Let me go to the slides and we will get.
And I will have to say, Brian has also done some work with me in regards to after the murder of George Floyd, looking at policing in the city of Jacksonville.
I have.
So, and it was very, very good work that we did. Just looking at the lack of trust with the minority community specifically in Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
It was an exciting engagement. I'll probably say too much, Tammy, but they required in the contract to have a person of color and a white dude. And I got to be Tammy's white dude in this situation. And it turned out she spent most of it holding me back rather than the other way around on some of these issues. So.
Yeah, they didn't know, but I did. And that was very intentional on my part.
So again, this is Tammy in Jacksonville, me over here in New Orleans and New Hampshire. And this is who we are. So let's get started. Let's get into this. So what we did is, this will be an interesting slide deck. It's all visual design. I think we have like 15 words. That's about it. And I want to just kind of popcorn back and forth with Tammy on issues of violence, risk, and threat assessment. And the whole purpose, I think, today is to look at the importance of having, let's say, your head on a swivel. Let's say situational awareness, trauma-informed. You want to be in a space when we're doing an assessment and building rapport with someone. And if you're not doing threat assessment, you're doing suicide assessment, you're doing a conduct intake, this really applies across all of these areas. We need to take into account, and this is how I'll phrase it, Tammy, I want to hear your phrase on this too. I think we have to take into account those external things that get in the way of the person freely and openly sharing and building a connection with us. Because if our goal is to collect data and good information, if there's something that's going to get in the way of that, we need to mitigate that up front. Tammy, is that fair to say, or how would you add to that?
No, I agree with that. And I think though also we have to take into account some cultural things.
Absolutely.
So if you do not identify, the way that person identifies, whether it be sexual orientation, ethnicity, things of that nature, it's really important that you are culturally competent in the way that you approach someone. Because within some communities, I mean, our Muslim brothers and sisters and African Americans sometimes, can be suspect,
Mhm.
and tend to shut down because are often told, or often brought up, seen that, authority may not be a trusted resource for them. Someone in a position of power, they may perceive them as trying to basically add to their downfall. And so you need to really be able to gain a relationship. And so it's going to take some relationship building in order for them to be transparent with
Yeah, and Tammy, I mean, that's part of your expertise, not only in the DEI space and culture and your lived experience, but also as a sociologist, that
you.
the study of people and groups, and we used to call this in the Title IX space. I never was super excited about the phrase, but we used it frequently in Title IX, closed community. And the idea was that certain communities have unique language and ways of interacting with each other. And for folks who are outside the community, if you don't have an awareness, a competency, a proficiency, a willingness to learn, you're going to miss things. So this isn't a program on wokeness or, being a good social justice warrior. We both probably think you should do those things anyway. However, like here, it's about the data that if you don't understand the group, they don't feel comfortable with you, they're not going to share things, and you're going to have big misses when it comes to this.
100%, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, the
100.
authority piece here, and this is one of like 10, 12 things we'll look at, that I think we have to just identify that there's going to be some students, some individuals, some employees that come into a threat assessment interview, and heaven forbid I start it like this. Hello, I am Dr. Van Brunt. I am the Chief Mental Health Officer at Western Kentucky University, and I run the counseling department. You've been asked to complete this assessment with me in order to determine if you are a danger to yourself or someone on campus, and to determine if you can remain on campus. Heaven forbid I start my introduction like that, because I've hit them so hard with my authority, they are going to be defensive as all heck. And I think it's finding that Goldilocks spot. Like, hi, I'm Brian. I've heard and I've read some of the reports about what brought you into this threat assessment. What I want to do now and to start is kind of hear from you. Like, how are you doing? Are you okay? What's going on? And I want to make sure that I'm understanding from your perspective how things unfolded. And I think there's a huge difference between those two positions. And depending on your role and your requirements and whether you're law enforcement or not, you might have some additional spaces to be. But attending to how we introduce ourselves and deal with the issue of authority is one of these issues of diversity and cultural competence in these areas.
Yeah. And definitely your tone,
Mhm.
I mean, like your tone is going to say a lot as well as your body language, like with the picture we show, that authority, I mean, she looks upset, she's closed off, it looks like she's ready to rumble, right? And if I come into a setting like that, I'm on the defense, because I see that so I'm prepared to be attacked. And so I probably would shut down and not really contribute much to the conversation.
Yeah, we will drop a this is where Bethany just is our like Chloe from 24 back there, just like doing it. I guess I get to be Jack Bauer. I'm gonna take that. We are gonna put into there a YouTube clip. It was the Toronto truck attack. It was an incel attack a couple years back, and the entire interview, again in Canada, bless your hearts. I don't know why the whole interview is up on YouTube, but it is. And the interviewer in that interview, I think it's worth watching. We've actually transcribed it for a book that we did. The way he engages, the way he uses authority in those spaces is amazing to me. It's not that he's getting rid of his authority, it's that he's using it within the interview to gather the information they need. So it's a great clip. Tammy, one of the things that comes up too, and I'd love your take on this, is just the interview space. I often talk about sometimes we have the good intention to create like a nice conference table with the plants and everything. And if we're taking someone in from a different culture, a different experience, or even just a college student, they're not spending a lot of time in conference rooms. So while we might, as faculty, be like, those chairs are nice, they got the full recline, I like the window and the plant, good temperature control, we have to look at it from their perspective, because the room itself, while we might think it's nice, it might also be adding to that authority piece.
Yeah, it looks pretty sterile to me. I like the round tables, better, where it's like four of us at a table. I find that to be much more intimate, in that regard, and showing that, I don't necessarily view you as a threat, but just want to engage in some dialogue and understand what's taking place. So that to me would be more welcoming, than something like this.
Yeah, and we get into aspects of convenience versus psychology and sociology, I suppose. The comment here about it being a barrier, you're absolutely correct. A table creates a barrier. I was doing a series, maybe some of you have seen these, of threat interview demonstrations, and we were filming in New Orleans, and it was Scott Lewis from TNG and Navita, if you know Scott. And we were given freedom to set up the room as we like. So I would do an interview, and I'm consummate counselor, chairs at 45 degrees, little table in between. And Scott, kind of requested a desk because he was approaching it from like a conduct perspective. So while the desk is certainly more convenient to kind of lay out paperwork and have access to the laptop and everything, we're always making this trade-off between the convenience of being able to write notes and have a comfortable space versus how we approach things. And Scott and I had some great conversations about this, about some of the differences between the positions, and maybe why sometimes it's nice to have a barrier. Maybe if there's a conduct meeting or something, having a bit more of a barrier might not be the worst thing. It's paying attention and being intentional about these choices that I think is the big point here.
Yeah, and then I also think to note like that one chair at the end of the table, I don't think it would be great for me as the authority figure, to sit there, because again, that's going to kind of reinforce,
Mhm.
that I am the authority figure, and may make some students kind of shut down during that interview process or be reluctant to be transparent with me.
It's a great point, Tammy. I mean, it kind of dovetails. Poor Bethany is going to be pulling up resources all day long. But another one we'll share with you was one on safety concerns. I was at a Title IX conference with ICS Lawyer, with Courtney and Betsy and her crew out of Nashville, great company. And they had us talk about safety in a Title IX interview. So the handout we'll have for you gives a list of some of these considerations. But it's exactly what you're saying, Tammy. Like, where do we position ourselves to maximize connection and reduce, conflict and increase rapport, versus where do we position ourselves if we need to leave the room in some speed? And it is this balancing act, and again, about the intentionality being important here. Well, this is coming up, right? So the issue of race, ethnicity, how we are in terms of who we are as people. I'll share, if I'm meeting with a student who is different, really in any possible way, I like the Columbo approach. I like taking a step down, and I like to begin a bit of a monologue and say, I'm a white person. I'm someone of European descent. You've had a different experience, clearly, as a person of color. I don't know that I can solve all of the differences between us, but I want to say that I'm aware of this. I do appreciate there's been some systemic things that you've experienced. You might have a different view of authority and law enforcement. That's okay to talk about in here. I'm not going to judge you or jump to any kind of conclusions or assumptions about this. So I think if there's something that's a clear difference between you and the other person, elephant in the room, if you will, that you should mention it. And I think there's an opportunity. Again, my approach is a bit more of a step down and to show some grace and some humility in this space. Other folks might have a different way of approaching that. I don't know how that hits you, Tammy, in terms of addressing that, or not. Like, what do you think?
No, I love the way you addressed it. I mean, because it's just the reality, and again, this isn't about wokeness or anything like that. It's just the reality of the society that we live in. And we know that there were systemic, there are systemic things. And then we also have to acknowledge cultural, right? If we have a student that's international student, there may be some cultural differences. Pre-pandemic, I remember, serving on the BIT team, and we had a student from the Middle East. And the Americans, again, pre-pandemic, have this ideal about the social space, right? But a lot of Europeans and Middle Eastern countries don't do that. And so when they would, when they speak with you, they may be more upfront, and some Americans perceive that as threatening, but it's cultural.
Right.
and it's not meant to be that way. So I think it's just really relevant that I love the way you introduced it, just saying, hey, I don't live your life. I haven't had these experiences. And I acknowledge that.
Mhm.
And if you lay it out like that, I think that that will get you a lot of buy-in, and that will help create that connection because you're already saying, I know that there are differences. I am not naive. I recognize it and I don't have the same experiences as you, but I want to make sure we connect and can have a good dialogue so I do understand what's taking place.
Yeah, it's really a perspective taking. I think therapists have and psychologists a leg up in this space just because it's what we do every day. I mean, the definition of therapy from the therapist perspective is meeting with a different new person, putting your self on hold and trying to wrap your head around their perspective and worldview. So I think whether we're teaching or doing any of this kind of work, I think this approach is something that's been practiced and goes fairly well. When someone comes in and they're pissed off at me as a director of counseling, parent, kid, whoever, I get to this place where I'm like, it's not me. They don't even know me. Like sometimes I'll even say that, like, you don't even know me. I understand though you've had bad experiences in the past with other people, and I might even try to interject some humor. You find out what works for you. I might say something like, I'm awesome. Like, you don't know me, but listen, I will win you over. And that confidence, not arrogance, but confidence, I think sometimes plays well with someone in that space. But I mean, here's the thing, Tammy, right? I didn't have, I was not one of the scientists at Tuskegee. I did not have the lab coat. I was not doing that work. But I have to be aware that people of color coming into an office of authority for an assessment, I mean, heck, if you're a psychology person, you know the MMPI-2 has an entire measure of defensiveness that adjusts for three populations. It adjusts for nuclear technicians, police officers, and people of color. And the reason it's like this weird Sesame Street game about like, what do those three have in common? They all have a heightened degree of defensiveness when being interviewed by a psychologist in a personality test. And it makes sense. The nuclear technician and the police officer, it's a high stakes interview to get a job. The person of color, they have not had a historic good experience with people in authority and lab coats saying, I'm here from the government to help you. Just trust me. And that's part of, I think, the history that we have to take into account. That's nothing to do with me personally, but it's
Mhm.
part of our shared history.
Right. And I mean, and as you said, like the people of color, like they know about eugenics, I mean, Tuskegee, the father of gynecology practiced, experimented on slave women. Like the community knows that. Our Muslim brothers and sisters, see what has happened after 9/11. Think of the Armenians and the genocide that took place there. So just recognizing, and again, has nothing to do with you, but you need to know that historical context from which that person is coming from, within that community.
Or you'll be less effective as an interviewer. Like that's what it comes back to. This is not a class on teaching DEI for the sake of building a better community. This is a class on teaching, this is going to make you a more effective interviewer, taking into account these different pieces to it. Now, do we think that's smart from a community and like a decency standard? Yes, clearly we do. However, again, this is the interviewing skills. Generational differences, we talk about this all the time. We have to attend to those. I'm a 50-year-old guy interviewing, say, a 22-year-old Black female who's come in because there was a threat issue. I need to address a couple things in the room. I'm not female. I am a different color, and I'm a way different age. So I have to play with those three at least differences that are present in that space. So I think we need to be aware of generational differences here and how they play out.
Yeah, and I think when I think of generational differences too, I often think of too, we could think of geographically or geography, right? So you're going to have people in the South, who are going to be yes sir, yes ma'am, especially if you're an older generation. They mean no disrespect, but that's just part of their upbringing. I'm from the Midwest. I would just say yes or no. But I also think with the generational differences that you have to be competent in their language as well, right? So, example, my 81-year-old mother, she does know how to text. But every time when she first began texting, at the end of every text, it would say LOL. And I was like, why are you always laughing out loud? And she was like, no, that means lots of love. So, I mean, so yeah, seriously. So we have to know, right? Some of the lingo and the things and the acronyms that the younger generation is using in order to build that connection for that interview and for them to be transparent. I've heard concepts like dabbing when they talk about marijuana, like what is a dab? And some people think it's a dance, where it's a whole, exactly, where it's this whole form of concentrated marijuana that's kind of more like hash, but all those things are very vital for us to understand when we engage, because Brian, I'm in your age group, when we engage with younger people, because we want to make that connection so we can have that good interview.
Oh man, I know we weren't going to mention people's names because we're recording this, but I'm doing it. Toby, what an awesome comment. Like virtue signaling, authenticity, and genuineness is key. You cannot be, and Bethany, you'll have to help me on this. Who's the Simpsons character who was the dog they introduced as like the extra character? You cannot be the guy who comes in, flips the baseball cap around, and is like, hey, that's real talk. Like you cannot be virtue signaling or being someone who comes off. And I think virtue signaling is synonymous in many ways with being inauthentic. So if
The
you come
dog
off
was Poochie. It was Poochie.
Poochie, good old Poochie, yeah, right. I'm cool,
Bethany
Poochie.
helped
Like,
us out.
you cannot, yeah, Toby, that's huge. It is an art and a science, and
Exactly.
also timing. Like one thing I was going to say earlier, we're going to save it till we get to sexual orientation. But having been a therapist with a lot of clients, I want to, back when I was doing more therapy, I would acknowledge that I was straight, they were gay. And in a therapeutic context, I would say, we have other therapists in the office who are gay. If you'd like to meet with Eric, he's available. I personally would like to keep meeting with you. That would be excellent. But I just want to own that. I don't want to spend 15 minutes talking about that because they might have come in for a whole other reason and they're not even talking about their sexual orientation. It was a tick mark on the box. So you very much have to proceed cautiously. I use like the Minesweeper example where you're kind of like clicking something and you kind of get a hint about where the bombs might be. You're looking for hooks and barbs. How do I pull the person in and how do I avoid getting caught on this hotspot? Tammy, when you think about virtue signaling, what's some advice about what to avoid there?
Yeah, trying to speak in what you perceive as the dialect of that group. That's another thing too. And I've seen that take place. And it's like, yeah, just be your authentic self and own who you are, but you have to be comfortable in your skin and recognize that there are some things that we're not going to know. But in order to, again, build and develop those relationships, throughout the conversation, we can gain insight. Later on, I may have to Google what that was, and to make sure I understood it correctly. But I just think that you need to be authentic because people can read right through you when you're not. And so if you're going to play with me, I'm going to play with you, and I think that you'll get a lot of that from the younger generation.
Mm-hmm. No, authenticity is huge. And it's also like, I think the generational point I'll make as well, it's not only the front presenting the elephant in the room and addressing that, it's our concepts. And we need to be, I feel strongly about this, that anyone who's doing threat assessment in any capacity with a certain population, like with our college student generation, if you're not on TikTok, you should be. Like, I can't say that strongly enough, that there are great insights to the different generations, what people are thinking, how they're receiving their news. When I was a child therapist, when I did trauma therapy with really young kids, I would go to Toys R Us. I don't even think it exists anymore, but I used to go to Toys R Us and I had a really tight Pokemon and Uno game. Like, because that's kids at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. When I'm talking with them, that's what they would do. They were interested in toys, and this was the way that we connected. So if you're working with a certain population, you have an obligation to learn about that population. And as Tammy said, GTS, Google that stuff, and take a look, or get Chat GPT. Like, I am just a new user to it. It was like $60 for the unlimited at plan. It's called Genie, and it is scary good. And you can ask it a question, and it's not just going to Google it for you. It actually gives a really nice summary answer. So, asking like, what is dabbing, to like Chat GPT, you'll actually get a really good answer in that space that'll help educate you there too. So, good conversation.
And Allison, I'm still into Uno too. So there are still some of
Right.
us, and I like pity pat. I don't know if you all know that, and spades and dominoes and all that good stuff too. So.
Yeah, it's knowing your population.
Mhm.
Another area of interest here, and this is another training that we have, but I want to just highlight the difference here between gender identity, how someone identifies in their gender, and it's typically male or female or non-binary. And then that is like a film strip. It's what's inside. It's how they feel about themselves. And gender expression, if you take the film strip metaphor, this is what they project into the world, how they're seen by others. So this brings up the question of pronouns. And I think having an awareness here of what are you signaling to someone if you're doing an interview, if your pronouns are available. I had a experience with a counselor, a therapist I was training way back when, who wore a big wooden cross. And as a Christian myself, I didn't have a problem with the cross, but I had a problem with that messaging that might be sent to the client and how she was going to manage that. So I think a lot of this is paying attention to the issues before they happen. If you're doing a threat assessment, you're getting good at this violence risk stuff or interviewing, and you don't know how you're going to answer the question, how old are you anyway? You should have that answer thought about before it comes up. And the same thing about pronouns, finding your comfort level with that and balancing out some of the professionalism related to it. That's an important issue for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, like with myself, when I was in academia as faculty, I always, the first day, hello everyone, I'm your professor. My name is Dr. Tammy Hodo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And then as my students went through, even when I had 150, because I wanted, them to share who they were, what they were majoring in, some would share their pronouns. And if it didn't go with how I perceived them to express themselves, then I would go ahead, and it was so simple, just write it on the attendance, on the roster, right? But I've also had, thinking culturally, students whose names maybe I would have struggled with. And that was another reason I wanted them to introduce themselves, because then I would spell out their name phonetically next to the attendance, because that's their identity. And I didn't want to mess that up. And I didn't, and having international students, I found students would have someone give them a name, an Americanized name. And my whole thing is, what? No, I can learn your name. I mean, that's the least I could do, because again, that's your identity. So it's just very important to acknowledge and recognize that.
No, spot on. And I think this is a tough topic because we have so much to share, and it's I'm just noticing the time, so we'll keep moving. But I will say this about gender expression, that I think it's in the same way you want to know how someone wants to be called. If they say their name's Elizabeth on the sheet on your intake, but then they say I go by Beth or Liz or Annie, it's the same rapport building necessity to pay attention to that. And Tammy, to your point, I don't know if you remember or have worked with Brycia over at CPSHR, but her name was new to me, and I mispronounced it a number of times. And and here's the beauty of it, right? We actually were able to make this into a point, and this won't surprise you, Tammy, I do it so well all the time, just being wrong and fumbling all over the place. I have a sense of humility. I apologize. And we actually now have it. It's part of our introduction anytime we're on a call together, because she knows I don't like doctor in front of Brian. I just like Brian. And I know that like Brycia took a while for me to kind of get into my head, which is weird because it's the beginning of my name and I should have known it sooner. But culturally, it's a different name that I wasn't around a lot, and it took me some extra effort to understand it. I love your example, Tammy, of having a little checklist or notes to help you in that space.
And I struggled with her name at first as well, Brian. So
it
took me, it wasn't just you, it was me as well.
Yeah. So, we'll cover these real quick and then get to some questions. We can go a little deeper in them. But, socioeconomic issues, again, these are tricky because they're often implicit bias. They're things that sneak up on us. So, we might make assumptions about things like transportation or timeliness of an interview when they're showing up, dress. And that, again, the devil here, if I have one takeaway, is look for developing hypotheses, which are educated, supported guesses rather than assumptions about the person. Someone shows up dressed to the nines. If I'm in Western Kentucky doing a threat assessment, I'm meeting with a person of color and they're wearing a suit to the threat assessment, I better know what dress means in the South for a Black person. And not for every Black person, but in an educated setting, this has a deeper meaning. In the same way, if I, as I learned in my office, if I ever implied, one of my, Howard, who was a great mentor to me, said, Brian, never call a Black woman lazy. And I'm like, well, first of all, Howard, I'd never do that because it's rude, but tell me why in particular. And he did. And I'm like, okay, good to know. So knowing about dress, someone might look at that and be like, he's trying to pull a fast one on me. He's done something wrong and he's dressing nice to try to make me feel like he's more, put together than I might assume. Or someone might dress badly or not have a particularly clean smell. There might be socioeconomic issues related to those things as well. So we don't want to make these assumptions.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and we definitely can't assume because a lot of it comes from places of bias, and the media has is one of the major units of socialization, and it has a lot to do with that. I mean, if we think of the recent shooting at the bank, and you look at the headlines and how they described him versus I think of, Trayvon Martin and how he was described, and just we don't even know, but subliminally it's being leaked into our brains. And so we make these assumptions and we have to just be really careful with that.
Absolutely. Your language itself, your mother tongue, natural language, what people are comfortable explaining. We look at pauses, we look at hotspots, we look in threat assessment at times where people don't seem to be as quick on a response. We look at eye contact. All of these things have cultural implications. So again, assuming things about different groups can be problematic. So understanding, different language and different cadence and how we speak and how we even view authority. Issues of physical disability as well, assumptions we might make about these issues as they play out. We also have issues of religion. Obviously, Tammy gave some good examples of those. We can dive into these in our Q&A. Tammy, I wanted to get your take on this one, though, the neurodiversity issue. In a threat assessment interview, neurodiverse individuals are seeing things from different perspectives. I came up with a cool graphic of a forest. We might look at the forest this way. A neurodiverse individual might look at it a little more zoomed in, maybe look at it from the ground up, maybe look very narrowly at a certain part of the forest. So we don't want to, the key here is make an assumption about a risk factor or a protective factor, an anchor factor in our assessment, and attribute that to one of the factors or a problem when it might be something more related to Asperger's, ASD, or a spectrum disorder. And even knowing some of the history of why some people don't use Asperger's anymore, how that title changed, and why some individuals are still very attached to Asperger's and being an Aspie, because that's part of their cultural identity. So, knowing and having some good research in this space can be important as well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have anything to add. I think you hit it on the nail.
Yeah. So last couple ones, politics, sexual orientation, we talked about a little bit. This is going to play mental illness, again, thinking about pauses, phrases, in that kind of information, all is really relevant, I think, as we go. I was at we were meeting some new friends in New Orleans this 2 days ago. And I had this moment of, she was talking and Stephanie, and had said, mentioned smaller, they make sour cream dip, relevant to the story. And she had said it was not in one of the smaller supermarkets, and she referred to it as a bodega. And I immediately was like, oh, bodega. Like, I grew up in Jersey, New York. Bodega is a term that's used in that space a lot more frequently. And I asked if she was from there, and she's like, oh, no. And it turned out, as I got to know her better, and we were really just meeting, that she was just very articulate. And it was one of those opportunities to kind of see that I had made maybe an assumption, but I was testing out that hypothesis. So it's good to pay attention to language, especially how language is used. Even like mispronunciations are important to attend to. Sometimes that's a striving up and could be a good thing as well. So it's even someone who's pretty good at stuff guesses wrong sometimes with the hypotheses, and being willing to see that as part of the process, I think is really important as well. Tammy, any final comments before we jump into questions, things that we covered that you wanted to highlight when you think about interviewing, maybe in particular to cultural issues, things to pay attention to, cautionary
Well,
tales?
yeah, thinking about, I'm a service-connected disabled veteran. And so if you were to meet me and see me, you would not know that. But we have to remember that every physical disability is not visible. And so I think as we have more veterans going to school after they serve, that we have to be cognizant of that as well. If they're a little louder, maybe they're having some hearing issues. We're not really sure. Maybe they have PTSD. You don't know that. You don't know what their experiences have been. And so everything isn't visible, when it comes into that disability space.
Absolutely. All right, we will end the recording here and then open it up for questions and chat.